morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a gentle shroud, softening the edges of the ancient church and the weathered headstones that dotted the churchyard. Miss Jane Marple made her way along the familiar cobblestone path, her basket of chrysanthemums from her garden held carefully in one gloved hand. At 73, she had developed the habit of arriving early for Sunday service, partly for the peace it afforded, and partly because she genuinely enjoyed arranging the altar flowers, a small service that brought her considerable satisfaction. The Church of St. Mary Mead had stood for over 4 centuries, its Norman tower a testament to the enduring faith of generations. Miss Marple had been attending services here for nearly 20 years, since she had first come to live in the village, and she knew every stone, every pew, every peculiarity of light and shadow that mark the passage of seasons within its walls. This particular Sunday morning in late October held that crisp quality that spoke of autumn settling into its stride. The leaves on the ancient oak trees surrounding the churchyard had turned to gold and russet, and there was a bite in the air that made Miss Marple grateful for her warm wool coat. She paused at the church door, fishing in her handbag for the large iron key that the vicar, Mr. Clement, had entrusted to her for her flower-arranging duties. As she turned the heavy key in the lock, Miss Marple found herself thinking, as she often did on Sunday mornings, about the various members of her small community who would soon be filing into these pews. There was something both comforting and revealing about the weekly ritual of Sunday service, the way people arranged themselves, the expressions they wore, the small gestures and glances that spoke volumes about the relationships and tensions that wove through village life like invisible threads. Her thoughts turned inevitably to Rosalind Fairfax, the young woman who had become something of a puzzle to the village over the past 6 months. Rosalind had arrived in St. Mary Mead in the spring, taking a position as companion to elderly Mrs. Pemberton, who lived in the large Victorian house at the end of Vicarage Lane. She was a quiet, well-educated girl of perhaps 25, with dark hair that she wore in a simple style and clothes that suggested modest means but good taste. What had made Rosalind remarkable, however, was not her appearance or her circumstances, but her peculiar relationship with Sundays. While the rest of the village looked forward to the day of rest, Rosalind seemed to approach each Sunday with increasing dread. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, Miss Marple's closest friend and the village's most reliable source of social intelligence, had mentioned more than once that Rosalind could be seen on Saturday evenings walking restlessly through the village, her face pale and drawn with what appeared to be genuine anxiety. "It's most peculiar, Jane," Mrs. Bantry had observed just the previous week over tea. "The girl seems positively haunted by Sundays." Mrs. Pemberton mentioned that Rosalind often spent Saturday nights pacing her room, and more than once she's been found in the early morning hours sitting in the church, just sitting there in the dark, as if she were waiting for something dreadful to happen. Miss Marple had found this information intriguing. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that such specific fears usually had very specific causes. People didn't develop an aversion to particular days of the week without reason, and the fact that Rosalind's fear centred on Sunday, the day of worship, of community gathering, of supposed peace and reflection, suggested something deeper and more troubling than simple melancholy. The heavy church door swung open with its familiar creak, and Miss Marple stepped into the cool, stone-scented interior. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting jewelled patterns on the worn wooden pews and the ancient stone floor. Everything appeared exactly as it should be, peaceful and prepared for the morning service. But as Miss Marple made her way toward the altar, her basket of chrysanthemums in hand, she noticed something that made her pause. The vestry door, which should have been closed and locked, stood slightly ajar. A thin line of shadow marked the opening, and something about it struck her as wrong. Not dramatically so, but wrong in the way that a picture hanging slightly askew disturbs the eye. Setting her basket down carefully on the front pew, Miss Marple approached the vestry door with the cautious steps of someone who had learned, through unfortunate experience, that small irregularities often heralded larger troubles. She pushed the door open gently and peered into the small room where the vicar kept his robes and where the communion elements were prepared. What she saw there made her draw in her breath sharply and take an involuntary step backward. Rosalind Fairfax lay on the floor of the vestry, her dark hair spread around her head like a fan, her face turned toward the ceiling with an expression that might have been peaceful, if not for the unnatural stillness that marked her as beyond all earthly peace. She wore her best dress, a simple navy blue wool that Miss Marple recognised from previous Sunday services, and her hands were folded across her chest as if she had been carefully arranged. On the small table beside her lay an open prayer book, its pages fluttering slightly in the draught from the open door. Miss Marple could see, even from where she stood, that several passages had been underlined in pencil, and a small piece of blue fabric, torn by the look of it, was caught between the pages. For a moment Miss Marple stood perfectly still, her mind automatically cataloguing details, while her heart acknowledged the tragedy before her. Then, with the presence of mind that had served her, well, in previous encounters with sudden death, she backed out of the vestry, closed the door firmly, and went to telephone for Dr. Haydock and Inspector Slack. As she waited for their arrival, Miss Marple found herself thinking about Rosalind's fear of Sundays. The girl had been right to be afraid, it seemed. Sunday had indeed brought her something to dread, though whether it was something she had anticipated or something that had found her despite her fears remained to be seen. The sound of approaching footsteps on the church path interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Haydock arrived first, his medical bag in hand, and his face wearing the expression of professional concern that she had seen too many times before. "What have we got, Miss Marple?" he asked without preamble, knowing from experience that when Miss Marple called about a body, it was invariably a body that required more than routine medical attention. "I'm afraid it's young Rosalind Fairfax," Miss Marple replied quietly. "In the vestry. She appears to have been there for some time." Dr. Haydock nodded grimly and headed for the vestry door. Miss Marple remained in the nave, her hands folded, her expression thoughtful. She was thinking about fear and Sundays, about prayer books and torn fabric, about the way death had come to find a girl who had spent months dreading its approach. Inspector Slack arrived with his usual bluster just as Dr. Haydock emerged from the vestry shaking his head. "Well?" Slack demanded. "Dead several hours, I'd say, sometime during the night. No obvious cause, but—" Dr. Haydock glanced at Miss Marple. "I think we'll need a more thorough examination." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She had suspected as much. In her experience, when young, healthy people died unexpectedly in churches on Saturday nights, natural causes were rarely the explanation. The girl who had feared Sundays had not lived to see another one, but Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that before this particular Sunday was over, they would all understand exactly what it was that Rosalind Fairfax had been so afraid of. The news of Rosalind Fairfax's death spread through St. Mary Mead, with the peculiar swiftness that tragic events possess in small villages. By the time the church bells should have been calling the faithful to morning service, they remained silent, and instead of the usual Sunday gathering, clusters of villagers formed along the lane, speaking in hushed tones and casting frequent glances toward the ancient building where police constables now stood guard. Miss Marple found herself gently but firmly removed from the church by Inspector Slack, who made it clear that her flower-arranging duties would have to wait. She stood now with Mrs. Dolly Bantry and several other regular churchgoers near the Lich Gate, all of whom seemed to need the comfort of familiar faces in the wake of such shocking news. Eleanor Clement, the vicar's wife, emerged from the church with the brisk efficiency that had made her indispensable to parish life. She was not a pretty woman, but she possessed a commanding presence, straight-backed and practical, with a pearl brooch glinting at her collar, and an air of someone who organised chaos into manageable lists. Her pale blue eyes held a mixture of genuine distress and something else that Miss Marple couldn't quite identify. "Such a terrible tragedy," Mrs. Clement announced to the gathered group, her voice carrying the authority of her position. "Poor Miss Fairfax. She was always such a troubled soul, I'm afraid." She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, though Miss Marple noticed her hands remained remarkably steady. "I must confess, Harold and I had been quite concerned about her recent behaviour. She had taken to visiting the church at very odd hours, Saturday nights particularly, sometimes quite late. This immediately captured everyone's attention. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward with the eager expression she wore when particularly intriguing gossip was afoot. "Saturday nights? But, Eleanor, surely that's rather unusual?" Mrs. Clement nodded gravely. "Indeed. More than once I found the church still lit when I came to check the locks. She would be sitting there in the dark, sometimes pacing near the altar. When I spoke to her, she seemed agitated, frightened even. I suggested she might find more comfort speaking with Harold during regular hours, but she always insisted she preferred the solitude. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully, noting the slight tension in Mrs. Clement's voice when she mentioned finding Rosalind in the church. There was something rehearsed about the explanation, as if the vicar's wife had been preparing this particular response. Mr. Figgins, the village postman, approached their group with the purposeful stride of someone bearing important information. At 65, he had been delivering mail to St. Mary Mead for over 30 years, and his knowledge of the village's correspondence patterns was encyclopedic. Terrible business this, he announced, though his tone suggested fascination rather than grief, though I can't say I'm entirely surprised, given the strange correspondence that young woman had been managing. Just yesterday evening she came to me in quite a state, pressed me to ensure 2 letters caught the London mail, one to a firm of solicitors in Bedford Row, and another to what looked like a boarding house in Torquay. White as a sheet she was, and her hands shaking when she handed them over. Mrs. Bantry practically vibrated with curiosity. Letters? What sort of letters? Well, I don't like to gossip about people's private correspondence, Mr. Figgins replied, clearly relishing his moment of importance, but under the circumstances. She'd been receiving anonymous letters regular as clockwork, every Friday for months. Heavy paper, expensive looking, but typed and posted from different areas of London each time. The girl would go quite pale when she saw them. Miss Marple found this pattern particularly intriguing. Anonymous letters arriving on Fridays would certainly explain Rosalind's increasing anxiety as each weekend approached, culminating in her Saturday night vigils at the church. Dr. Haydock emerged from the church at that moment, his expression grim. The little group fell silent as he approached, and Miss Marple noticed how each person's face reflected not just curiosity but a particular kind of tension. "I'm afraid I can confirm that Miss Fairfax did not die from natural causes, Doctor," Haydock announced quietly. "Inspector Slack will want to speak with all of you, particularly those who had recent contact with her." A ripple of shocked murmurs ran through the group. Mrs. Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm. Murder? Here in St. Mary Mead? Before anyone could respond, Inspector Slack appeared with his characteristic lack of subtlety. "Now then," he announced, "I'll need to know about Miss Fairfax's movements yesterday. Anyone who spoke with her or saw her after 6 o'clock. "I saw her near the Lich Gate around 7, offered Mr. Larch, the church treasurer, who had positioned himself where he could observe both the police activity and the gathered villagers. "She was with that Crawford fellow, Mrs. Pemberton's nephew." Raised voices they had. "He's got a temper on him, that one." Miss Marple observed the immediate shift in the group's attention. James Crawford. She remembered him vaguely as a young man of perhaps 30, employed sporadically in his uncle's business and more regularly at the Green Man public house. Mrs. Bantry had mentioned rumours about gambling debts and questionable associates. "Crawford's been in financial difficulties," Mr. Larch continued, with obvious relish. "Word is he's been helping himself to his aunt's household accounts. If Miss Fairfax discovered that—" Mrs. Clement pressed her lips together disapprovingly. "We mustn't jump to conclusions, Mr. Larch. Though I did notice Rosalind seemed particularly distressed yesterday evening when I saw her walking past the vicarage." As the group began to disperse under Inspector Slack's watchful eye, Miss Marple found herself walking slowly toward her cottage with Mrs. Bantry. She was thinking about fear and Sundays, about mysterious letters and Saturday night confessions, about a young woman who had sent urgent correspondence to solicitors and boarding houses on the very night she died. Most intriguingly, she was thinking about the reactions she had observed, who had seemed genuinely shocked, who had appeared relieved to have a convenient suspect in James Crawford, and who had spoken with just a little too much certainty about events they claimed to have witnessed from a distance. The girl who feared Sundays had indeed found something to dread. But Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that the real question was not what Rosalind had been afraid of, but who had been afraid of what Rosalind might reveal. Inspector Slack's return to the church brought with it the familiar atmosphere of official investigation. Constables taking measurements, photographers documenting the scene, and the general bustle of police work that seemed somehow incongruous within the ancient stone walls. Miss Marple, having given her initial statement, found herself politely but firmly encouraged to step aside while the professionals conducted their examination. However, Inspector Slack's practical nature soon reasserted itself. "Miss Marple," he called, consulting his notebook with characteristic authority, "you know this church better than anyone here. Before we proceed further, I'd appreciate your observations about anything that strikes you as unusual or out of place." Miss Marple moved slowly through the nave, her practised eye taking in details that might escape a less familiar observer. The morning light had strengthened, casting the interior in the golden glow that made St. Mary Mead's church particularly beautiful during autumn services, but today the beauty felt somehow tainted by the tragedy that had occurred within these walls. "The hymn books," she said after a moment, pausing at the third pew from the front, the pew where Mrs. Pemberton usually sat during her infrequent church visits. "They've been disturbed quite recently. Mrs. Clement arranges them very precisely each week, spines aligned, numbers in sequence. But look here." She gestured to several books that lay askew, one still open to a hymn halfway through, with what appeared to be a small tear in the page corner. Inspector Slack dutifully noted this observation, though his expression suggested he found it less than immediately significant. Miss Marple continued her examination, moving toward the altar where her abandoned basket of chrysanthemums still waited on the front pew. "The altar flowers," she murmured, studying the arrangement that should have been replaced with her fresh blooms. "They're from last week, Michaelmas daisies that should be quite wilted by now, but someone has rearranged them recently and the water in the vases has been changed. Fresh water, and the stems have been recut." She leaned closer, noting the faint scatter of pollen on the altar cloth. "Done hastily, I should think, and by someone less practised than our usual flower arrangers." What drew her attention most particularly, however, was the church clock, the ancient timepiece which had marked the hours for St. Mary Mead's, faithful for over 2 centuries, was behaving in a most peculiar manner. "Inspector," she called softly, "I believe you should examine this clock. When I arrived this morning, it showed 20 minutes past 7, while my watch read past. But I distinctly remember hearing it strike 6 twice within 10 minutes on Thursday evening, and yesterday afternoon it failed to chime at all between 3 and 4 o'clock. Inspector Slack approached the clock with renewed interest. "Clocks break down, Miss Marple. Old mechanisms, you know." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied mildly, "but in my experience, when timepieces begin to behave erratically at precisely the moment when establishing time becomes crucial to an investigation, it's worth considering whether the irregularity might be deliberate rather than mechanical." Dr. Haydock emerged from the vestry at that moment, his expression grave. "Inspector, I can confirm that Miss Fairfax did not die from natural causes. The preliminary examination suggests poisoning, something that would have acted within an hour or two of ingestion. Based on the state of rigor mortis, I'd estimate death occurred sometime between 11 o'clock Saturday evening and 2 o'clock Sunday morning." This revelation sent a murmur through the small group of officials present. Miss Marple absorbed the information quietly, her mind already working to fit this new piece into the puzzle that was beginning to form. "The prayer book," she said, moving toward the vestry where the evidence had been carefully preserved. "May I examine the marked passages more closely?" The book lay open on the small table, now dusted with the fine powder used to search for fingerprints. Miss Marple studied the underlined verses without touching the evidence. The selections were focused on themes of confession and divine mercy, but more specifically, they dealt with the burden of keeping dangerous secrets and the consequences of remaining silent in the face of wrongdoing. The torn piece of blue fabric caught between the pages proved particularly intriguing. Miss Marple examined it as closely as she dared without disturbing the evidence. "Fine wool," she observed, "expensive and well made. The tear appears very fresh. The threads are still sharp at the edges, suggesting it was torn within hours of being found. And it's not from Rosalind's dress. Her navy wool is a different weave entirely." Inspector Slack pounced on this detail with satisfaction. "Blue wool. Could be from Crawford's suit. He had a blue serge at the Whitsun races, I remember. Looked quite the dandy." Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. "It could indeed be from a gentleman's suit. Though I notice the shade is rather particular, not navy or cornflower, but nearer to that forget-me-not blue that's sometimes used for choir vestments. The vestry door has a splinter by the latch that might catch delicate fabric if someone were closing it hastily. Their examination was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Jameson, Mrs. Pemberton's housekeeper, who appeared genuinely distressed as she approached Inspector Slack. "Begging your pardon, Inspector, but Mrs. Pemberton is beside herself with worry. She's been asking for Miss Rosalind since early this morning, and when I told her what had happened—" Mrs. Jameson paused to compose herself. "She keeps saying there's something important she needs to tell someone about Miss Rosalind's troubles. Something about letters that had been frightening the poor girl terribly." This information immediately captured Inspector Slack's attention. "Letters? What sort of letters?" "Anonymous ones, sir. Coming regular as clockwork every Friday for months now. Miss Rosalind would go quite pale when she saw them, and lately she'd been talking about writing to solicitors and such, trying to find some way to make them stop." Miss Marple found herself thinking about the timeline this suggested. Anonymous letters arriving on Fridays would certainly explain Rosalind's increasing anxiety as each weekend approached, culminating in her Saturday night vigils at the church. The girl had been living in fear, and someone had been deliberately cultivating that fear. "We'll need to speak with Mrs. Pemberton immediately," Inspector Slack declared. "Miss Marple, if you'd accompany us?" "You seem to know the household." As they prepared to leave the church, Miss Marple took one final look around the scene. The disturbed hymn books, the freshly arranged altar flowers, the unreliable clock, and the torn blue fabric all spoke of hasty actions taken under stress. Someone had been in this church after Rosalind's death, attempting to arrange things in a particular way, but the arrangements had been made by someone whose nerves were not entirely steady. The girl who had feared Sundays had been silenced before she could reveal whatever secret had haunted her, but Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that the secret itself might be less important than the identity of the person who had been willing to kill to keep it hidden. And that person, she was increasingly certain, was someone who moved freely through the village, someone trusted enough to have access to the church, and someone whose own fears had finally driven them to the ultimate desperate act. As they walked toward Mrs. Pemberton's house, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar cruelty of a murder designed to look like despair, committed in a place meant for hope and redemption. The killer had chosen their setting carefully, but in doing so, they had also provided clues that a sufficiently observant person might piece together, if they knew how to look beyond the obvious and into the small, telling details that revealed the truth about human nature. Mrs. Pemberton's Victorian house stood at the end of Vicarage Lane with the dignified bearing of old money carefully preserved. Miss Marple had visited here occasionally over the years for parish business, and she knew it to be a house where tradition held sway and secrets were kept behind polished mahogany doors. Mrs. Jameson led them through the front hall to the morning room, where Mrs. Pemberton waited in her favourite chair. At 82, she retained the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to, though recent illness had left her frailer than Miss Marple remembered. Her pale, blue eyes held sharp intelligence despite her distress. "Inspector Slack," she said without preamble, "I've been expecting you. This terrible business about poor Rosalind, I fear my nephew James may be involved, though it pains me to say so." Inspector Slack settled with his notebook, clearly pleased to have a cooperative witness. "Please tell us everything, Mrs. Mrs. Pemberton's hands trembled as she reached for a leather portfolio beside her chair. Rosalind had been receiving anonymous letters every Friday for months, threatening letters that distressed her terribly. She spoke of paying for past mistakes, and mentioned someone demanding money to keep quiet about a scandal from her previous position. She was consulting solicitors, trying to find a way to stop the blackmail without destroying her reputation. "Who else knew about these letters?" Slack asked. "My nephew James handles many of my business affairs. He would have seen the mail, and I'm afraid—" She paused reluctantly. "James has been experiencing financial difficulties, gambling debts. He's been rather insistent about taking over more of my accounts directly." Miss Marple noted the small escritoire by the window, where a leather folder tied with blue ribbon caught her attention. Forget-me-not blue, the same unusual shade as the fabric found in the prayer book. "When did you last see your nephew?" Slack continued. Yesterday evening, around 7 o'clock, he came to collect some papers and spoke with Rosalind in the garden. Their voices were raised, and she seemed quite distressed afterward. She asked for the evening off to attend to urgent correspondence, and I didn't see her again. The sound of the front door opening interrupted them, and James Crawford entered with the air of someone who expected rooms to receive him. He was handsome in a slightly flashy way, wearing a brown tweed suit with a tie too bright for mourning. The lines around his mouth suggested more charm than character. "Inspector," he said with forced ease, "I hear you want to ask about poor Miss Fairfax. Tragic business, but if you're planning to make a scandal of it—" "Where were you between 10 o'clock last night and 2 this morning?" Slack cut in. "At the Green Man until closing, then home by 11:30, Crawford replied promptly. "Cards with Sam Ruddle and the carrier." "Ask anyone." "You were seen arguing with Miss Fairfax near the Lich Gate around 7, Slack pressed. "Mr. Larch places you there." Crawford's jaw tightened. "We spoke, yes." "At the corner of Vicarage Lane, not the Lich Gate." Miss Fairfax had become impossible lately, interfering in matters that didn't concern her. She threatened to write to lawyers about some supposed irregularities in my aunt's accounts. Completely unfounded accusations, but she wouldn't listen to reason. "What colour suit were you wearing yesterday evening?" Slack asked. "This one," Crawford said, indicating his. "Brown tweed. I save the blue serge for Sundays. Not that I attend services regularly." Miss Marple's gaze dropped to his cuffs, noting the slightly shiny fabric, but no fresh tears or stray threads. She lifted her eyes thoughtfully. Slack's pencil scratched across his notebook. "You had clear motive, mister. Crawford Miss Fairfax was threatening to expose your embezzlement and was writing to solicitors. You had opportunity. You argued with her at 7, were free after the pub closed, and you have access to this house. She died between 11 and 2. "I never saw her after Vicarage Lane," Crawford burst out, a flush rising under his skin. "She was trying to blackmail me, if you must know. Said she'd go to my aunt's lawyer Monday morning, unless I made good what she claimed I'd taken. I told her I'd find a way to resolve it properly. I went to the Green Man, played cards, and came home." As Slack prepared to arrest Crawford, Miss Marple spoke quietly. "Inspector, might we verify Mr. Larch's observation? It depends upon the church clock, which has been quite unreliable recently, sometimes slow, sometimes failing to chime entirely. One must be careful anchoring testimony to an untrustworthy timepiece. She was thinking of other inconsistencies too, the altar flowers recut and arranged by unpractised hands, the torn blue fabric that didn't match Crawford's brown tweed, the deliberate tampering with the church clock. These suggested careful planning rather than desperate improvisation. Crawford seized on her words with relief, but Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful. The case against him was certainly plausible. He had motive, opportunity, and had been seen arguing with the victim. Yet something about the scenario troubled her. In her experience, when evidence pointed so clearly to an obvious suspect, it was worth considering whether someone might be deliberately arranging that evidence. As Slack led Crawford away, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar cruelty of using a man's genuine flaws to disguise someone else's greater crime. Crawford was certainly a scoundrel, but she was beginning to suspect he was also a convenient scapegoat, one whose guilt would satisfy the village's need for justice, while allowing the real killer to remain hidden among the respectable citizens of St. Mary Mead. The girl who had feared Sundays had been silenced, but Miss Marple was increasingly certain that her death had less to do with embezzlement than with secrets that ran far deeper than anyone yet suspected. With Crawford in custody and the immediate crisis seemingly resolved, Miss Marple found herself granted an unexpected opportunity to examine the evidence more thoroughly. Inspector Slack, satisfied with his arrest, had permitted her to study Rosalind's prayer book more carefully, particularly the marked passages that had caught her attention during the initial investigation. She sat in the quiet vestry with the book spread before her, the afternoon light filtering through the narrow window casting gentle shadows across the pages. The underlined verses told a story of profound spiritual struggle, passages about bearing witness to wrongdoing, about the weight of keeping dangerous secrets, and about seeking divine guidance when earthly authorities failed to provide justice. The pattern of markings struck her as deliberate rather than random. "Come, ye sinners, poor and wretched. just as I am without one plea, Rock of Ages, cleft for me. Each hymn spoke of confession, of seeking forgiveness, of preparing for a difficult reckoning. Most significantly, several verses dealt with the moral obligation to speak truth, even at personal cost. Between the pages of Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, Miss Marple discovered what Inspector Slack's hurried examination had missed: a small sprig of dried herb, carefully preserved between thin sheets of tissue paper. She lifted it delicately and caught the faint but unmistakable scent, bitter green and medicinal. Her memory, well stocked with knowledge of cottage gardens and old-fashioned plantings, identified it immediately. Rue, herb of grace, as it had been known in earlier times, a plant traditionally associated with repentance and sorrow for sin. Not a flower, one pressed idly, but a deliberate symbol of penitence. Miss Marple recalled seeing a mature rue plant in Mrs. Pemberton's garden, near the sundial, where the elderly woman often sat on pleasant afternoons. The connection sent her directly back to Mrs. Pemberton's house, where Mrs. Jameson met her with the weary expression of someone who had endured too much excitement for one day. "Perhaps I might walk in the garden," Miss Marple suggested gently. "I believe it held special significance for Miss Fairfax, and I'd like to understand her better." Mrs. Jameson readily agreed, leading her through the house to the terrace doors. The garden beyond showed the careful maintenance of generations, with autumn flowers still blooming in thoughtfully planned beds. Miss Marple found the rue plant exactly where she remembered it, a low, grey-green mound beside the sundial, showing the fresh, ragged look of recent picking. "Miss Rosalind came here every Saturday evening," Mrs. Jameson offered, following Miss Marple's gaze. "She'd sit on that bench there with her prayer book, sometimes for hours. She called it her preparation time, said she needed to find courage for what Sunday would bring." "Did she speak of what troubled her so deeply?" Miss Marple asked, settling on the stone bench where the impression of frequent use was still visible in the worn surface. Mrs. Jameson's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Only once, about a month ago. She said she had witnessed something terrible in her previous position, something that had resulted in an innocent person being blamed for a crime they didn't commit. She felt responsible for remaining silent, but she was terrified of speaking out." Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting into a clearer pattern. The anonymous letters, they weren't demands for money, were they? "Oh no, miss. They were threats, warnings to keep quiet about what she'd seen. She said they came from someone who knew exactly where she was, who could reach her anywhere. She'd tried to escape by coming here, but the letters followed her." Mrs. Jameson's hands twisted in her apron. She was planning to go to the police this week, finally. Said she couldn't live with the guilt anymore, even if it meant risking her own life. The tragic irony of Rosalind's situation became clear to Miss Marple. The girl who had feared Sundays had been using them as a deadline for courage, preparing each week to confess not her own crime, but her knowledge of someone else's. The rue in her prayer book wasn't just a pressed herb, it was a weekly reminder of the penance she felt she owed for her silence. "She always said Sunday was the day for truth," Mrs. Jameson continued. "She'd pick that rue every Saturday, press it in her prayer book and say her prayers here before going to the church. She was working up to telling someone she trusted who could help set things right." As they walked back toward the house, Miss Marple noticed a choir scarf draped over a garden chair. Blue wool in that distinctive forget-me-not shade she had seen torn in the vestry. Mrs. Jameson followed her glance. "Mrs. Clement left that when she brought flowers for the missus last week. Said she'd collect it when next she came." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The evidence was forming a pattern now. Someone with access to the church. Someone who knew Rosalind's Saturday night ritual. Someone who could manipulate the church clock and arrange a private meeting in the vestry. Most importantly, someone who had killed before and was willing to kill again to prevent their first crime from being exposed. James Crawford, whatever his other faults, was not their murderer. The real killer was someone far more dangerous, someone who moved freely through the village, trusted and respected, who had been watching Rosalind's weekly preparation for confession and had finally acted to silence her forever. The girl who had feared Sundays had been preparing to honour the truth, but her courage had come too late to save her own life. Miss Marple's discovery of the pressed rue and the choir scarf had illuminated Rosalind's weekly ritual of preparation, but it also raised troubling questions about who else in St. Mary Mead might have feared the girl's planned Sunday confession. As she made her way back toward the village centre, the blue wool scarf folded carefully in her handbag, Miss Marple found herself considering the intricate web of relationships that bound their small community together, and the secrets that might tear it apart. Her first stop was the vicarage, where she intended to return Mrs. Clement's choir. Scarf Eleanor Clement received her in the morning room with her usual brisk efficiency, though Miss Marple noticed a tension around her eyes that hadn't been there before Rosalind's death. "How thoughtful of you to bring this back," Mrs. Clement said, accepting the scarf with steady hands. As she unfolded it, Miss Marple observed her pause, barely perceptible but real, over a small snag near the edge where the wool had caught and pulled. Not quite a tear, but the kind of damage one might receive from a sharp edge or splinter. "When did you last wear it?" Miss Marple asked conversationally. "Saturday afternoon for choir practice," Eleanor replied, perhaps a fraction too quickly for someone who usually measured her words carefully. "Though I must have left it at Mrs. Pemberton's when I brought flowers earlier in the week." Miss Marple's gaze drifted naturally around the familiar room, settling on a small leather writing case on the escritoire. The lid lay slightly ajar, revealing what appeared to be several promissory notes and a folded paper with racing fixtures written in an anxious, cramped hand. Reverend Clement entered at that moment, and the sight of his face, gentle, tired, and bearing the particular strain that comes from carrying shame, told Miss Marple more than any confession might have. His usual serene demeanour had been replaced by something approaching desperation. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, taking her hand with genuine warmth, "forgive the state of things. We've had such a shock with poor Miss Fairfax. I cannot reconcile it with anything sensible." Eleanor's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Marple, kindly return my scarf, Harold. Perhaps you should mention the matter of the diocesan correspondence." The slight emphasis on diocesan carried significant weight. Miss Marple folded her hands and waited, having learned long ago that silence often proved more effective than questions. Harold Clement sank into his chair as if the weight of his burden had suddenly doubled. "Miss Marple, I should have informed the church council weeks ago. I made some foolish wagers in the spring, small amounts, I thought, hoping a modest win might help cover a shortfall in the roof fund. When I lost, I tried to manage the debt privately. I contacted a person in much Benham who extends credit to gentlemen in temporary difficulties." Eleanor's pale eyes flashed with controlled anger. "I discovered Harold's situation and took steps to resolve it quietly. A scandal would have destroyed his ministry and harmed the entire parish. We were making arrangements to set everything right when that girl began her endless prying." "Rosalind noticed the irregularities?" Miss Marple asked gently. "She helped with various parish records," Eleanor replied stiffly. "She had an unfortunate tendency to examine documents that weren't her concern. Papers have a way of revealing more than intended when one looks too closely." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She was preparing for some sort of confession, I understand. Saturday night visits to the church suggest someone seeking courage for a difficult revelation. The uncomfortable silence that followed spoke volumes. Miss Marple excused herself and continued her quiet investigation, encountering Mr. Larch near the post office. The church treasurer appeared unusually flustered, clutching a manila envelope as if it contained either salvation or damnation. "Such a terrible business with Miss Fairfax," she observed pleasantly. Larch startled visibly. "Indeed, most shocking, though Crawford's arrest comes as no surprise. I've long suspected irregularities in his handling of his aunt's affairs." "You were quite observant to notice his argument with Miss Fairfax. The timing must have been precise." "Well, Larch hesitated, his face flushing. "Actually, I may have been mistaken about the exact time. The church clock has been unreliable, and I was rather distracted. I'd received correspondence from the diocesan office requesting a complete audit of our accounts." Miss Marple's expression remained pleasantly interested, while her mind worked rapidly. A diocesan audit would uncover any irregularities, and she recalled recent whispers about postponed church improvements and Mr. Larch's private financial difficulties. "The building fund has faced some challenges recently," she observed mildly. Larcher's grip tightened on his envelope. "Temporary setbacks in my investments required some creative accounting. Nothing dishonest, you understand, merely borrowing against future contributions." Miss Fairfax asked rather pointed questions about the discrepancies when she helped organise Mrs. Pemberton's charitable records. Dr. Haydock, encountered outside his surgery, provided the final piece of the puzzle. "You're right to ask about Mrs. Pemberton," he told Miss Marple quietly. "She's been concealing the severity of her heart condition. Pride, fear of being seen as infirm. Her medications are carefully measured, and Miss Fairfax kept meticulous notes about her condition. The girl was discreet but thorough in her observations." "Did many people know the extent of Mrs. Pemberton's illness?" "Only the immediate household and myself. Mrs. Pemberton would rather die than have the village know her heart is failing. Her will and estate arrangements become quite significant in light of her condition." As Miss Marple walked home through the golden autumn afternoon, the full scope of Rosalind's dangerous position became clear. The girl had not simply been keeping one secret, she had become a repository for multiple damaging revelations. Her weekly preparation for confession, her growing determination to speak the truth, had threatened to unravel the carefully constructed respectability of several prominent villagers. The vicar's gambling debts, managed by his controlling wife, the treasurer's borrowing from church funds, Mrs. Pemberton's concealed illness with its implications for inheritance, each secret alone might have been manageable, but together they represented a powder keg of scandal that could destroy reputations and lives. Most significantly, Miss Marple realized that the murderer had not acted from sudden panic, but from calculated desperation. Someone who understood village dynamics, who knew Rosalind's habits, who could move freely through the church and manipulate evidence to point toward convenient suspects. Someone whose own position in the community gave them both access and motive to silence the girl who feared Sundays. The anonymous letters, the careful staging of the crime scene, the manipulation of the church clock, all suggested a mind that planned methodically and understood how to use others' weaknesses as camouflage for their own guilt. Crawford's arrest had provided perfect cover, but Miss Marple suspected the real killer was still moving freely among them, protected by respectability and trust. The girl who had feared Sundays had been right to be afraid, but her death had been orchestrated by someone who understood that the greatest crimes often hide behind the most virtuous facades. The urgent knocking at Miss Marple's cottage door came just after dawn on Monday morning. Mrs. Jameson stood on the doorstep, her face drawn with fresh grief and her hands trembling as she clutched her black shawl against the morning chill. "Miss Marple, please come at once," she whispered. "It's Mrs. Pemberton. She passed away in the night. Dr. Haydock is with her now, but something feels terribly wrong. She seemed stronger yesterday after speaking about Miss Rosalind, and now—" Miss Marple gathered her coat without hesitation. As they walked through the quiet village streets, the morning mist seemed to carry an ominous weight, as if, saint, Mary Mead itself sensed that death had visited twice in as many days. Dr. Haydock met them at Mrs. Pemberton's front door, his expression troubled rather than resigned. "Her heart gave out sometime during the night," he said quietly, but his tone carried uncertainty. "Mrs. Jameson found her this morning when she brought the tea. She appears peaceful, but—" He paused meaningfully. "The timing concerns me. Yesterday she seemed remarkably alert for someone with her condition. In Mrs. Pemberton's bedroom the elderly woman lay composed in her bed, her hands folded peacefully across her chest. Miss Marple approached slowly, her observant eye cataloguing the scene's details. The bedside table held the usual array of medicine bottles, spectacles, and a small leather journal, but something was amiss. Her medication routine was quite precise, Mrs. Jameson explained, wringing her hands. Dr. Haydock had given very specific instructions about dosages and timing. She was most particular about following them exactly. Dr. Haydock examined the medicine bottles against his prescription card. "The digitalis is missing," he said grimly. "The small brown bottle with her heart medication. She had a fresh supply just last week. A thorough search revealed the empty bottle tucked away in the dressing table drawer, an odd place for someone as methodical as Mrs. Pemberton." Miss Marple studied the displaced bottle thoughtfully. digitalis requires precise dosing, doesn't it, Doctor? Absolutely. The margin between therapeutic and toxic doses is narrow. Too little provides no benefit. Too much stops the heart entirely. His expression grew more concerned. An overdose would mimic the very condition it's meant to treat. Moving to examine Mrs. Pemberton's personal effects more closely, Miss Marple noticed the leather journal lay open to recent entries. The neat figures recording medication times and dosages were clearly Rosalind's careful handwriting, until the final entries, which showed a different hand. The ink was slightly more purple, and the sevens were crossed in a way Rosalind never employed. "Someone else made the final entries," Miss Marple observed quietly. On the small escritoire near the window, she discovered another telling detail. A few strands of that distinctive forget-me-not blue wool caught on a splinter in the wood, the same unusual shade as the fabric found in Rosalind's prayer book, the same colour as Mrs. Clement's choir scarf. The pattern was becoming unmistakably clear. Mrs. Pemberton had possessed dangerous knowledge about the village's secrets, knowledge that Rosalind had confided during her months as companion. The elderly woman had been preparing to share this information with Inspector Slack, making her the next target for elimination. "Mrs. Jameson," Miss Marple said gently. "Did Mrs. Pemberton receive any visitors yesterday after I left?" "Yes. Someone came to offer condolences about Miss Rosalind and discuss parish matters. I was preparing dinner, so I didn't see clearly who it was, but I heard voices in the morning room for quite some time." This second death represented a crucial mistake. While Rosalind's murder had been carefully planned and staged to implicate James Crawford, Mrs. Pemberton's death showed signs of desperation. The killer had acted hastily without time to create an elaborate deception. The missing medicine bottle, the forged ledger entries, the convenient timing, all pointed to someone losing control of their carefully constructed plan. Most significantly, the killer had underestimated the cumulative weight of evidence. The blue wool fibres appearing at both crime scenes, the pattern of witness elimination, the intimate knowledge of both victims' routines, these details painted a portrait of someone who moved freely through the village's most trusted circles. As Dr. Haydock arranged for a more thorough examination of Mrs. Pemberton's body, Miss Marple reflected on the killer's psychology. The first murder had been committed to prevent revelation of past crimes, but this second death revealed something more dangerous, a willingness to kill repeatedly to maintain silence. The murderer was not just desperate, but utterly ruthless, viewing human life as expendable when it threatened their security. The girl who had feared Sundays was dead, but her death had not brought the safety the killer sought. Instead, it had created new dangers, new evidence, new patterns that pointed inexorably towards someone who had believed themselves above suspicion. Mrs. Pemberton's murder was not just a crime, it was a confession of guilt, written in the desperate actions of someone who could no longer control the consequences of their original sin. Miss Marple walked home through the morning mist, her mind working methodically through the accumulating evidence. The killer was making mistakes now, acting from panic rather than calculation, and in their haste to silence witnesses, they had provided the very clues that would ultimately expose them. By Tuesday afternoon, Miss Marple had conceived a plan that would require the most delicate execution. She sent carefully worded invitations to several key members of the community, requesting their presence for tea at her cottage to share memories of dear Rosalind and offer mutual comfort in our grief. The timing was crucial. Inspector Slack remained convinced of Crawford's guilt, but Mrs. Pemberton's death had begun to trouble him, and Miss Marple knew she had a narrow window to gather the evidence she needed. Mrs. Dolly Bantry arrived first, as always eager for any social gathering that might yield interesting revelations. Eleanor Clement followed shortly after, bearing a small bouquet of late chrysanthemums and wearing her most sombre expression. Mr. Larch appeared precisely on time, clutching his hat nervously, while Dr. Haydock completed the gathering, settling into his chair with the weary air of someone who had witnessed too much tragedy in too few days. Miss Marple served tea with her usual grace, allowing the conversation to flow naturally toward memories of Rosalind. She listened carefully as each guest contributed their observations, noting not just what they said, but how they said it, the slight hesitations, the too quick responses, the careful avoidance of certain topics. "Poor child seems so troubled these past weeks," Mrs. Bantry observed, stirring her tea thoughtfully. always carrying that prayer book of hers, marking passages as if she were studying for an examination. Eleanor Clement's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer. She was a devout girl, certainly, perhaps too much given to brooding over spiritual matters. Miss Marple refilled cups with practised ease, then spoke casually. I understand she kept quite detailed records. Mrs. Jameson mentioned finding a diary among her belongings. Pages and pages of observations about village life. Most illuminating, apparently. The reaction was immediate and telling. Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional interest. Mrs. Bantry's eyes lit up with curiosity. Mr. Larch shifted uncomfortably, but maintained his expression of polite concern. Eleanor Clement, however, showed a momentary flash of something that looked remarkably like relief. "A diary?" Eleanor asked, her voice carefully modulated. "How comprehensive of her." "I do hope it contained nothing that might embarrass the families she served." "Oh, I believe Inspector Slack found it quite revealing," Miss Marple replied, watching faces carefully. "Particularly the entries about her weekly preparations and her observations of various people's movements around the church." "The poor girl's private thoughts shouldn't be subjected to public scrutiny," Mr. Larch protested nervously. "Some things are better left undisturbed." "Quite right," Eleanor agreed quickly, her posture relaxing slightly. "Though, I suppose if it helps resolve this terrible business with Crawford." Miss Marple noted the subtle shift. Eleanor had relaxed when the conversation turned to Crawford's convenient guilt, rather than dwelling on the fictional diary's contents. It was the reaction of someone who believed a dangerous truth had been safely contained. "She had such a fondness for particular hymns," Miss Marple continued mildly. "The diary mentions her favourite quite often. Lead, kindly light, if I remember correctly." "It was, 'Dear Lord and Father of Mankind,'" Eleanor corrected immediately, colour rising slightly as several heads turned. "I mean, Miss Fairfax mentioned it during choir discussions." Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled. How odd, for she was such a quiet little thing, not much given to talking about her preferences. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin smile. "One learns these details when organising parish activities, Dolly." Miss Marple offered another slice of seed cake to smooth the small ripple of tension. "I was struck by how thoughtfully someone had tended the altar flowers that Sunday morning. Michaelmas daisies keep well, but only if the water is freshened regularly. Such careful work, and done so hurriedly, I thought." "Saturday evening after choir practice," Eleanor said promptly. "We ran quite late, but I always ensure the church is properly prepared for Sunday service." "How dedicated of you," Miss Marple murmured. "One wonders what poor Rosalind was planning to reveal that Sunday." Mrs. Pemberton mentioned the girl had finally found courage to speak about something that had been troubling her for months. The silence that followed was profound. Eleanor had gone very still, her teacup frozen halfway to her lips. "Perhaps her death was a mercy, in its way," Eleanor said finally, her voice slightly strained. She seemed so tormented by whatever burden she carried. Miss Marple found this response particularly revealing. While the others had reacted with curiosity or concern about injustice, Eleanor had immediately focused on the relief that death might bring, suggesting someone who understood intimately the weight of guilty knowledge. As the gathering concluded with polite expressions of sympathy, Miss Marple watched their departures carefully. Mrs. Bantry left with cheerful chatter. "Doctor." Haydock appeared thoughtful but untroubled, and Mr. Larch hurried away with obvious relief. Eleanor Clement, however, paused at the garden gate, her expression unreadable as she gazed back at the cottage. Miss Marple stood at her window, watching Eleanor's retreating figure with growing certainty. The fictional diary had served its purpose perfectly, revealing who feared its contents and who felt relief at Crawford's conviction closing the case. The killer had shown their hand in the subtle ways that only someone truly observant might notice. The girl who had feared Sundays had been silenced by someone who understood fear intimately, but in trying to eliminate all witnesses, the killer had provided Miss Marple with exactly the evidence she needed to expose the truth. That evening, Miss Marple requested Inspector Slack's presence at the vicarage, along with Dr. Haydock and Mrs. Bantry. The gathering felt sombre as they settled into the familiar morning room where Eleanor Clement served tea with her characteristic precision, her pearl brooch catching the lamplight. Reverend Clement sat pale and drawn, his gentle hands trembling slightly as he accepted his cup. Miss Marple remained in her preferred corner chair, her knitting folded quietly in her lap, but her eyes held the sharp focus that those who knew her had learned to recognize as significant. "I've been thinking about fear and Sundays," she began mildly, "and how our poor Rosalind arranged her week around both. The anonymous letters arrived on Fridays, creating dread that built through Saturday until she gathered courage for her Sunday ritual. She pressed rue, herb of grace, in her prayer book each week, preparing for a confession that had nothing to do with her own sins." Eleanor's hands remained steady on the teapot, but Miss Marple noticed the slight tightening around her pale blue eyes. "The person who killed Rosalind understood that timetable intimately," Miss Marple continued. "They knew she came to the church every Saturday night, knew she was building towards Sunday revelation. Only someone with complete access to the church would attempt to tidy the scene afterward, recut altar flowers hastily, disturb hymn books while trying to straighten them, tamper with the church clock to muddle witness testimony about timing." Inspector Slack leaned forward with growing interest. "The clock tampering? You're certain it was deliberate?" "Oh yes, an old trick and rather foolish, because only someone with keys and authority can adjust a church timepiece. The blue wool fibres found in Rosalind's prayer book match the distinctive forget-me-not shade of our choir scarves. Mrs. Clement's scarf, left at Mrs. Pemberton's house, showed fresh, snagging from the vestry door splinter. Eleanor set down her cup with careful control. "Circumstantial observations, Miss Marple. Hardly evidence of murder." "Human arrangements are evidence," Miss Marple replied gently. "Yesterday at tea, I mentioned falsely that Rosalind's favourite hymn was Lead, Kindly Light. Only you corrected me immediately to Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, the very hymn where she pressed her weekly rue. You knew, because you had examined that prayer book after her death, looking for what evidence she might have left." The silence grew heavy. Dr. Haydock studied Reverend Clement with professional concern, noting the tremor in his hands, the irregular pulse visible at his temple. "Rosalind discovered something far more terrible than embezzlement," Miss Marple said quietly. "She recognized the symptoms she was witnessing in you, Reverend Clement, because she had seen them before in her previous position. Someone was slowly poisoning you, small, careful doses designed to weaken you gradually, to make your eventual death appear natural while positioning your gambling debts as motive for suicide." Harold Clement stared at his wife in dawning horror. "Eleanor!" "The digitalis from Mrs. Pemberton's medicine cabinet," Miss Marple continued inexorably, "was not the first poison used, merely the most convenient for silencing witnesses. Mrs. Pemberton had to die because Rosalind had confided her suspicions, and the elderly woman was preparing to speak to Inspector Slack." Eleanor's composure finally cracked, her voice rising with desperate justification. "You don't understand the pressure, the constant fear of exposure. Harold's weakness was destroying everything, the debts, the scandals, the threats from creditors. I was protecting us both, managing what he could not, by murdering an innocent girl who was trying to save your husband's life." Dr. Haydock's voice carried professional disgust as he reached for Harold's wrist, checking his pulse with practiced concern. "She was going to confess on Sunday morning," Eleanor said desperately. "She'd found traces of what I'd been giving Harold, recognized the symptoms. She was writing to solicitors, preparing to destroy everything we'd built here." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but implacable. "So, you arranged to meet her in the vestry Saturday night, used her own trust in your pastoral authority to get close enough to administer the fatal dose. You staged the scene carefully, hands folded as if in prayer, but your nerves betrayed you in the small details, the hurried flower arrangement, the torn fabric from your scarf." Inspector Slack rose grimly. "Mrs. Eleanor Clement, you are under arrest for the murders of Rosalind Fairfax and Mrs. Pemberton." As Eleanor was led away, her final words carried a chilling practicality. "It was the flowers that gave me away, wasn't it? I never had the proper touch for arranging them." "It was the fear," Miss Marple replied quietly. "Fear always directs the hands, and observant eyes can always tell." The vicarage fell silent as the door closed behind them. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with a sigh, reflecting on the terrible irony that the girl who had feared Sundays had been murdered by someone who feared Sunday confessions even more. Rosalind's courage had come too late to save her own life, but through the evidence she left behind, pressed flowers, marked hymns, and the simple determination to speak truth, she had finally exposed the wickedness that wore such a respectable face. The Sunday that never came for Rosalind Fairfax had nevertheless brought the revelation she had died trying to make. Eleanor Clement's confession came in the grey hours before dawn on Wednesday, delivered with the same methodical precision she had brought to parish organisation. Inspector Slack, with Dr. Haydock present as witness, recorded her statement as she explained how she had orchestrated the anonymous letters through the Parish Mission Society's weekly postal packets, ensuring they bore different London postmarks to maintain the illusion of a distant threat. She had been slowly poisoning Harold for months, she admitted, using carefully measured doses of various substances designed to weaken him gradually, while making his eventual death appear as suicide, brought on by gambling debts and clerical scandal. The insurance money and church property would have provided her with both financial security and the social standing of a tragic widow. Rosalind's discovery of the poison traces had shattered Eleanor's careful plan. The girl's background as a companion to elderly invalids had given her knowledge of symptoms and medications that proved fatal to Eleanor's scheme. When Rosalind began documenting her observations and preparing to speak with authorities, Eleanor had acted with desperate calculation, using the girl's own trust in pastoral authority to lure her to the vestry that fatal Saturday night. The village struggled to reconcile the Eleanor Clement they had known, efficient, devoted, seemingly the perfect vicar's wife, with the woman capable of cold-blooded murder. The betrayal cut deep, transforming their peaceful sanctuary into something darker and more complex. Trust, once broken so completely, would take considerable time to rebuild. Harold Clement, shattered by the revelation and weakened by months of subtle poisoning, resigned his living immediately. Dr. Haydock oversaw his recovery, confirming the slow, debilitating effects of Eleanor's supporting drafts. The congregation, initially shocked, rallied around their broken vicar with genuine sympathy, understanding at last the true source of his trembling hands and failing health. James Crawford was released with grudging apologies, though his reputation remained tarnished by his genuine financial improprieties. He left St. Mary Mead shortly after, presumably to rebuild his life away from judgmental eyes. Mr. Larch quietly repaid the church funds he had borrowed, his face perpetually flushed with mortification whenever parish finances were mentioned. The memorial service, held the following Sunday, drew nearly the entire village. The ancient church felt different now, not corrupted exactly, but marked by the knowledge of what had occurred within its walls. Yet there was also something cleansing about the truth finally being revealed. Miss Marple had arranged the altar flowers herself, autumn blooms chosen with careful symbolism, rosemary for remembrance, lavender for devotion, but notably no rue. That herb of penitence belonged to Rosalind's private ritual, not to public display. Dr. Haydock delivered the eulogy with genuine warmth, speaking of both victims without resorting to empty platitudes. Rosalind Fairfax came to us seeking peace, and found instead a burden of knowledge that ultimately cost her life, he said simply. She died because she chose conscience over safety, truth over silence. Mrs. Pemberton died because she refused to let that courage go unrecognized. As the congregation filed slowly out into the autumn sunlight, Miss Marple remained seated, reflecting on the peculiar way that evil often defeated itself through its own excesses. Eleanor's first crime had been carefully planned and might have succeeded, but her desperation to silence witnesses had led to increasingly reckless actions that ultimately provided the evidence for her conviction. The anonymous letters, the staged crime scene, the second murder, each had been intended to ensure Eleanor's safety, but had instead created the pattern that exposed her guilt. In trying to eliminate all threats to her secret, she had revealed the secret itself to anyone observant enough to see the connections. Walking home through the village she had called home for 20 years, Miss Marple reflected on how Sunday's promise of redemption had been twisted by fear into something deadly. Eleanor had feared Sunday confessions so deeply that she had committed murder to prevent them, yet in the end It was Sunday that brought the revelation Rosalind had died trying to make. The girl who had feared Sundays had achieved in death what she had been preparing for in life, a confession that exposed wickedness and brought justice. Her weekly ritual of pressing rue in her prayer book, her careful documentation of symptoms, her growing determination to speak despite personal cost, all had contributed to Eleanor's eventual exposure. As Miss Marple reached her cottage gate, she paused to look back at the church tower rising above the village rooftops. Tomorrow would bring another Monday, another week in the life of Saint Mary Mead. The routines would resume, the community would slowly heal, but they would remember Rosalind Fairfax, the quiet girl who had found courage to face her fears, armed with nothing more than pressed flowers, marked hymns, and an unshakable conviction that truth must ultimately triumph over comfortable lies. In her garden that evening, Miss Marple arranged fresh roses with steady hands. Fear makes hands clumsy, she reflected, but truth requires only patience and careful observation. The girl who feared Sundays had finally found her peace, and in doing so had ensured that justice would have its day as well.